Greetings. I wanted to spend a few minutes here just kind of introducing you to some of the policy analysis materials and asking some questions and trying to generate some ideas for your papers and debate halls and so forth. What I first wanted to mention was from Dr. Weiss's work on the interaction of the sociological agenda and public policy, published in Wilson's Sociology and the Public Agenda. And basically, Carol Weiss asks four basic questions related to public policy, and I think these are very relevant and important to ask. And the first one is, how do policymakers influence the criminal justice perspectives? Second, how do criminal justice professionals influence policy? Third, is criminal justice research separate and independent from public policy? And fourth, do criminal justice professionals and public policymakers respond independently? So I think there we begin to see the interesting feature about trying to understand what policymakers and criminal justice professionals do and how they relate to each other, and how they influence each other, and how they may or may not operate totally independent or interdependently. So I want you to think about that, those questions and some of those ideas regarding the interactions. Because I always wonder, that I'm obviously from the research side, the criminal justice research academic side, and I often wonder, how often or what gets into policymakers' agendas, what gets into their heads, how do they know, or how do we influence policy? Should we be influencing policy, and if so, how? And how does this all make sense in terms of our values and our own biases as it relates to public policy? I've had a difficult time working my own research into local policy debates, probably for a variety of reasons. Possibly one, my personality, and two, maybe the policymakers didn't like my findings and my recommendations, and three, maybe I just don't really have a good grasp on how to work with policymakers, but I'm always striving to get better at that, and at the very least, I'd like to see policymakers using the research and using that research to make policies that actually decrease crime and other social problems and make society better. And of course, the big debate already has started. What is considered better? Tonry talks about 6 general approaches in the crime and public policy area, and so I wanted to mention those: criminal law enforcement, prevention, harm reduction, regulation, decriminalization, and non-intervention. And so a lot of times you'll find some researchers and policymakers may have more of a focus in one or several of those areas. For example, maybe in harm reduction and prevention, maybe in criminal law enforcement, and so forth. So I think that's also relevant and important to ask as well, as we begin to see certain journals that specialize in areas related to specific policies or different approaches, and professionals that specialize in certain areas where their policies may be related, for example, substance abuse issues, or child abuse issues, or domestic violence, or property crimes or cybercrime, and so on. And also we'll be able to think about comparative policy analysis, where we look at different policies related to different effects and also political aspects of policy analysis, and how policies operate in specific social systems. And that can be a very relevant feature to analyze as well. What may work in one location may not in another. And so we can also look at similarities and differences in different policies and how policies have been put into practice and the outcomes of those. Also, we'll see in a lot of our readings that we come across statistics. And Joel Best, in two of his very intriguing works, Damned Lies and Statistics, and More Damned Lies and Statistics, points out several features I wanted to mention. And he asks the question, what do statistics tell us and how do we use them? And what will our audience understand from our presentation of statistics? That's something else that we always have to consider working on more, and more is being able to clearly present our research findings and other research findings in not only in the classroom where it's extremely important, but also to the general public as well. It reminds me, quick funny story. I was doing a presentation to a bunch of child protective workers years ago, and I said, and using the Wilcoxon-signed rank test, we found that there was no statistically significant difference. And one of the directors put up her hand and said, "What in the hell are you talking about?" And, I stopped all of a sudden, taken back, and everyone kind of looked at me, and I realized I needed to explain what I was trying to say and not cloud it in, this terminology that only specialists or academics would understand. So we have to translate the meaning of our findings so people can understand not only what we found but also the limitations as well. It wouldn't shock me if cause and correlation get confused frequently in the policy debates and in public audiences. And, how good are official statistics? Well, many of you know that from your own professional work and how official statistics are calculated and how they move from one organization to another and how we may have different methods of determining if particular crimes or effects occurred or outcomes occurred. And then Best recommends that we ask ourselves, who created the statistic, why, and then how was it created? So we'll find there may be biased estimates, and we have to take a close look at that, the sampling procedures, and all the things that you would be learning in a research methods class. All that comes into play in really analyzing policy. Best points out we should beware of mutant statistics. 4 out of 5 dentists recommended a certain chewing gum a while back. I haven't seen that commercial in a long, long time. I'm wondering if they replicated their study and found only 3 out of 5 did. I don't know, but I understood based on their commercial that the 5th person was bit by a squirrel during the experiment and ran. And so really that, since you couldn't get a logical explanation from him, it would be 4 out of 4. Of course, that's a good example of mutant statistics and meaningless. But I think you would be surprised how often those show up in policy debates and in the media and in the public domain. And then what happens when groups or individuals don't like your statistics? What happens then? And how do you cope with the stat wars? And how do we confuse people with statistics? And so I'm always striving to be able to communicate clearer, and I'm trying to do more public presentations now since I'm doing a lot more online teaching, and I'm always having to work on bettering my communication methods of my research findings. And one of the features that he points out that's problematic is often very important information is left out on how the statistic was constructed. So just some things to be aware of. And then I wanted to give an example real quick. Johnson, Mayer, and Friedman's 2001 article, What Public Policies Affect Heroin Users, from the Journal of Applied Sociology. It's a very interesting feature. They looked at similar and different policies in New York City and Sydney, Australia. And they focused on how public policies influence behaviors, lifestyles, and consequences of heroin users in 2 cities. They had a very small sample, 16 in each group, but they used a longitudinal ethnographic study matched in each city. So even though it's a very small sample and would need replication, and also we wonder how this materializes in other cities, it's kind of interesting if you look at the tables that I have in the PowerPoints at New York City versus Sydney. You can see that the policies are very, very different, and the outcomes were also very, very different. But I think it's interesting to look at that there were policy conflicts between agencies, and there were low levels of drug treatment to start with, and there's also the continuation to use heroin in both samples, and also there were other problems as well. So this is always important, I think, to look at in the policy analysis. But in looking at the interventions and the outcomes, it looked like Sydney had more favorable ones to solving heroin-related crime problems. And then a study in 2009 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I have the reference on the PowerPoint of Vita Jokes et al. From the New England Journal of Medicine issue 361, pages 777 to 786. They looked at using prescription heroin to treat illegal heroin addiction for those who failed methadone treatment. And they found prescription heroin users had lower levels of criminal activity compared to methadone users, although side effects can be a problem. And then they presented some statistics on that. Now, the reason I present that is think about how controversial something like that might be. And so especially now we see these problems.